Outside the Utopia, in another part of the laboratory, a vent was discreetly being closed, much to Peter's surprise.
"You're remarkably courteous for a squatter," Peter remarked.
Jupiter shrugged with a knowing smile.
"Actually, I suppose you could call me a guest."
Monster grunted, his eyes still betraying his lingering suspicions.
"Define guest."
Jupiter chuckled. Stu's questions, however, were more practical. He looked around the platform where they all stood, noticing the rivets in the floor and the sudden drop-off along the edges. The sounds of strange, unrodent-like cries floated up from below.
"Where are we, anyway?"
"Standing on cages," Peter answered. "The great apes keep their specimens here. Many, many specimens, of many varieties."
"Not only rats and mice," Jupiter added, "but also cats, dogs, guinea pigs, and even a few monkeys."
Stu shuddered.
"Well, y'all can explain some of those things to me later. Right now, let's get out of here."
Jupiter smirked, a strangely vicious gleam entering his eye.
"Of course. This way, my friends."
With that, the rat threw a rope over the side of the cage, having fastened one end in the groove just under a rivet. As he gave the rope a tug, the loop slipped into place. Jupiter then hopped over the side with a devil-may-care laugh, leaving Stu and Monster in stunned silence. "Uh-oh," Matrix squeaked, giving voice to the sentiment they all felt.
"Come, son,"
Jupiter's voice called back up.
"The rope is plenty strong, and there's no one about to stop us."
Peter approached the edge, and looking down, spotted Jupiter's grinning face gazing back up at him.
"And how are we supposed to make the return trip if the great apes should discover this rope?"
"We'll find another way,"
Jupiter cut him off.
"I should think a pair of Olympian rats would be able to outthink a handful of apes."
Peter then felt a tap on his shoulder. As he glanced aside, he found himself looking into the unblinking yet confident eyes of Matrix.
"Very well then. Come, lads, we're going for another climb."
"Oh, here's hoping it's the last one,"
Stu groaned, rubbing his eyes. The little shrew could scarcely have imagined the sheer scale of that chamber until he reached the floor and saw the towering walls of cages rising on either side, with all manner of animals trapped within. A chorus of chatter and howls and yowls went up as the cage's occupants spotted the group of rodents dashing across the floor. "Right here!" Jupiter shouted over the uproar. He came to a stop beside a faint crack in the bottom of the wall. Hooking his fingers into a series of holes in the wall, Jupiter gave a strong tug, prying open a hidden door. Peter and his companions hurried inside and were soon followed by Jupiter as the rat pulled the door shut. Peter glanced around at his surroundings. A high, narrow passage, running as far as the eye could see to the left and sharply hooking around a corner to the right. Stu raised a suspicious eyebrow.
"Home sweet home, eh?"
"These passages run all throughout the building," Jupiter explained. "One of my prouder achievements, really, though some of the less traveled areas tend to be a little more Spartan. No sense putting up pictures where I'll never see them, of course."
"Of course,"
Peter agreed. Monster eyed Jupiter, and then Peter, his brow furrowing. Whatever the large mouse was thinking, however, he kept it to himself. "This way to my living quarters," Jupiter spoke up, leading towards the bend to the right.
"Living quarters?"
Stu exclaimed.
"Buddy, skip the bed and breakfast, will ya? All we want to know is the way to Elizabeth."
Jupiter shot an irritable scowl Stu's way.
"Please," Peter interjected. "I'm sorry for my friend's indelicacy, but our mission is rather urgent."
Jupiter glanced back to Peter, and his expression softened. "Of course. I keep most of my resources in a central location. It will be far easier there to find your friend. And, might I add, more comfortable as well." Extending a hand down the hall, he added, "So, gentlemen, shall we?" Peter nodded. As Jupiter turned his back, however, Peter gave Stu a warning glance.
"Hey, what did I do?"
Following after Jupiter, the little group found themselves walking down another long, bare corridor. After a time, the hall split in two directions. One continued straight ahead, and the other rose up a rat-sized flight of stairs to a higher level. Jupiter led them up the latter. A short time later, the corridor opened up into a small, squarish chamber, a little door similar to the one Jupiter had opened earlier set into the far wall. Jupiter led through this door, and into the room beyond. As first Peter, then Monster, and finally Stu passed through the door, each of them paused instinctively for a moment to take in the new sight. It was quite impressive. Even their old enemy, the Big Cheese, would have been jealous. The walls rose high about them, every inch hung with paintings of varying sizes, styles, and subjects. There were vivid, intricate paintings of landscapes, animals, and mice and rats, men, women, children, elderly. There were surreal cubist scenes of joy, sorrow, and passion, and equally surreal visions painted in photographic detail. There were scenes from classic literature, figures from ancient mythologies and modern film, and illustrations of characters and events from all manner of books and poems. Large, overstuffed, rat-sized chairs and couches leaned against the lower walls, offering comfortable positions from which to observe the various works. Jupiter beamed with pride as he took note of his visitors' expressions.
"Home, sweet home."
When no one responded, he quickly added,
"I painted them myself. There were no models, and I could see little of the outside world, so I just had to imagine it all."
Yes, very impressive," Peter mumbled. Catching himself, he added, "I really mean that. It's all excellent work, but I came here for help rescuing my friend, not to take in fine art." Monster signaled his agreement with a low grunt. Jupiter's proud smile faded.
"Well, of course. All is forgiven, and no harm is done."
"Forgiven?" Stu muttered. Monster exchanged a glance with the shrew. By the look in his eyes, it was clear they were thinking the same thing.
"Now, step this way,"
Jupiter went on, oblivious. He led to the other end of the hall, hooking his fingers behind a rather large painting of an open door, and pulled open a real door. Stu cast a sidelong glance up at Monster and whispered, "Paranoid much?" Monster growled his agreement.
He does appear to have an affinity for secret passageways."
On that note, the two trailed after Peter as he followed Jupiter into a rat-sized stairwell just beyond. The door swung closed behind them, drawn into place by a spring-loaded mechanism, concluding with a low grind of cement on cement. Stu jumped a bit in surprise as the door nudged against his back. Ahead, a spiral staircase wound its way upward to a higher chamber. As Stu approached the first step, his brow furrowed with the sudden sensation he had seen this place before. "Hey, Gong!" he mumbled, nudging Monster in the side. Monster gave Stu a warning growl, but then fell silent as the same sensation of déjà vu fell over him. "This place look familiar?" Monster gazed up, down, and all around at the dull, dark brickwork and nodded.
"Our dream."
"The tower," Stu added. The stairway didn't run quite as high as what Monster and Stu recalled, but as they emerged onto a higher landing, they couldn't shake the sensation that they were back in the obsidian tower of the warlock Theraxis. Light flooded the dark landing as Jupiter opened a final door and led into the next chamber. The room was lit by a rat-sized chandelier hanging from a ceiling high overhead, which cast an array of shadows from the foot of a tall bronze statue which stood at the center of the room. "Someone sure is full of himself," Stu mumbled as he looked up at the very idealized sculpture of Jupiter.
"Or self-conscious,"
Monster growled back. Attractive features, such as Jupiter's whiskers, his shoulders, and his cranium, were emphasized, while less attractive features, such as his abdomen, front teeth, and legs, were variously obscured and downplayed. The walls of the room were lined with shelves, stacked all the way up to the ceiling. A ladder mounted on a rail allowed easy access to the higher levels. Several chairs sat at the foot of the statue, interspersed with small end tables, rounded in shape to fit around the statue's cylindrical base. Whoa, Stu whispered, rubbing his glasses and returning them to the tip of his nose. If Elizabeth saw this place, she'd faint.
Then perhaps you should all stay a while, Jupiter called back with a sly grin. And to answer your earlier remark, yes, I do have a fair opinion of myself.
Monster smirked and gave a low chuckle. Stu glared up at him.
Y'all ain't doing any better than I am, pal.
Monster's face quickly eased into its usual scowl at Stu's observation. He was right, of course, and that was enough to sober up the big mouse. Peter silenced both of them with a disapproving look and shook his head.
Thank you for the offer, Father, he answered Jupiter, his gaze resting firmly on Stu and Monster. But I think we should leave as soon as Elizabeth is free. This isn't a place any of us should linger any longer than we have to.
What's eating him?
Stu muttered to Monster.
This way, my friends,
Jupiter called back to the others. He stood under a low arch, which formed a sudden, yawning black opening amidst the shelves of books.
The key to finding anyone in this building lies just through here.
Peter abruptly followed and was quickly joined by Monster. Stu glanced at a few books' spines as he trailed after Monster. He saw a number of titles accompanied with Jupiter's name, and a good many more with names on their spines he didn't recognize, and which meant nothing to him.
I'll have to ask Elizabeth about these later,
the shrew mused. Elizabeth may have fainted at the sight of all those books, but what Peter found in the next room was enough to make him faint. There were a number of shelves, yes, and the standard workbench, and tools and spare parts neatly organized and arranged on the shelves, the work table and various counters. But what really took his breath away was the machine set against the far left wall. There were knobs and buttons, and lights flashing, and little sounds of beep and boop, as was to be expected from such a rudimentary computer. But what stood out to Peter were the many, many monitors. These were not giant screens scavenged from great ape supplies. They were, in fact, built perfectly to scale for a rat, and then assembled together in a giant 5x5 screen network, each monitor displaying the feed from a different camera somewhere in the lab.
Incredible, Peter breathed. Looking to Jupiter, he asked, Did you build all of them yourself?
Jupiter shrugged.
Well, I managed to acquire some designs from the great apes, but yes, the rest of it was me. The planning, the combination of structures and functions, and then, of course, the assembly.
Peter peered closer at the various screens, comparing angles and distances to his own memories of the building's layout.
I say, you've tapped into the lab's security feed.
Jupiter couldn't help a satisfied grin.
And more. Look, here.
At this, he pointed to a monitor 3 screens from the left and 2 screens from the top. Peter's brow furrowed as he looked up at it.
It reminds me of old pictures from great ape history books.
His fingers curled into a tight fist, nails digging into his palms. Peter didn't see mice or lab specimens scurrying about. He didn't see the food dispensers or the clean water. What stood out to him were the solid walls and high fences, and the hollow, soulless expressions of the enclosure's inhabitants.
One of the great ape's experiments,
Jupiter explained, quite oblivious to Peter's reaction.
I can observe nearly anything they're up to.
Peter let out a long breath.
Yes, no doubt.
I trust you can find you a friend with this?
Peter nodded.
Given time, I believe so.
Then I'll take my leave.
Jupiter inclined his head as he backed towards the exit.
I have some business to attend to. A delivery to make, you might say. I'll be back soon, my son. I promise.
Peter was barely aware of Jupiter's parting comments. His attention was firmly fixed on the vision of captive mice. He managed a curt, "Thank you," but by the time the words left his mouth, Jupiter was already gone. Yet, though Peter's gaze lingered on that haunting monitor for a time, he did not see Elizabeth among the captive mice, for at that moment she had ventured into a hidden place beyond the camera's sight. There was more to shake Elizabeth than simply the strange rat who invaded the Utopia habitat. There was the matter of the biters, always eager to invade, and Elizabeth's responsibility to hold down her quadrant against them. She had managed to escape them once, and then fight them once, but Elizabeth was keenly aware that she could only hold out against the biters for so long. She needed help. Thus, in the wake of the aborted attack, she went looking for someone she knew was up to the task. The old Alpha was not out among the other mice, nor was he hiding on the fringes of the quadrant. That left only one place he could have been, and the one place Elizabeth had not yet set foot. The same old stench greeted her once more. Yet what Elizabeth once chalked up to the close proximity of dozens of sweaty bodies packed together was now clearly something else.
Alpha?
She called through the opening.
Alpha, are you in there?
You're the Alpha,
His low, rough voice answered.
I'm nobody. What do you want?
It's the biters.
Not my concern.
Elizabeth sighed. Yes, she should have expected this.
But surely you want to keep your territory safe.
It's not mine anymore. It's yours. So keeping it safe is your concern.
And I suppose you expect the biters to make that distinction?
I expect the biters to know better than to bother me.
Elizabeth scowled into the dim chamber. The old Alpha was remarkably adept at ending discussion. Well, then, Elizabeth just had to be even more adept at keeping it going.
And what about everyone else?
Your job.
And you trust me to do it?
Now it was the old Alpha's turn to pause.
Well, you beat me, and I saw you do a fair number on the biters earlier.
They would have outnumbered me if Demon hadn't scared them off, you know.
The answer was a very cold,
good.
And then, if there's no Alpha?
The position's up for grabs. I've beaten everyone else before, and I can do it again.
And in the meantime, if the biters attack?
Not my problem.
Elizabeth set her hands on her hips in a huff.
So we're back to that again.
She turned her head away from the dark opening and took a final breath of the fresher, open air outside, before venturing into the box. As with the floor outside, in the box there were bits of the odd fluff scattered about, but in far more sparse clumps. A handful of women lounged listlessly about, laying variously on the ground and on small, uncomfortably thin nests of the stuff. The Alpha, meanwhile, sat in a far corner, head hanging between his shoulders, his tail curling around to one side, while his legs jutted out at abrupt, awkward angles, feet sticking straight up in the air. Elizabeth had the intense impression of a child pouting.
Alpha.
Go away.
The Alpha didn't so much as look up as he said it.
Let them all die. Maybe I'll go be Alpha to the biters. They won't challenge me. And everyone'll be sorry when they overrun this place.
Elizabeth fought to contain her disgust. She closed her eyes and silently counted to 10. When she opened them again, she looked long and hard at the Alpha. Yes, that was exactly what she was looking at. A child pouting. Everything about the Alpha screamed little boy, except for his size. From his reaction to being told no when they first met, to the way he sat now, to his utter lack of the social graces.
Just leave me alone.
There must be someone here you care about. A friend? A family?
The Alpha was silent for a moment. Then he looked up, an expression of intense confusion on his face.
What? Or what?
Elizabeth was stunned into silence. She cleared her throat uneasily and began again.
You know, a friend?
Is that like a front end or what?
Elizabeth blinked.
I'll take that as a no, then. Well, what about family?
Two utterly clueless eyes stared back at Elizabeth.
A mother? Father? Brothers? Sisters?
You mean like Father, Son, and Brother Rainbow? They can drop dead with the rest of them.
Elizabeth nearly chuckled.
No, not like that. I mean, well, you must have had a mother. A father would be like the male counterpart.
A mother?
You know.
Elizabeth nodded, folding her hands over her stomach.
The woman that gave birth to you, who took care of you until you could walk and then taught you to take care of yourself. Knits you sweaters around Christmas that you wear to make her smile and then never think of again. The first woman who loved you.
The light of conscious thought flickered in the Alpha's eyes, as if just on the verge of burning out.
I don't remember any. I didn't have love? I was always... What's love? It's always just been... Huh? Elizabeth became keenly aware of many other sets of eyes suddenly focusing in on her. Noses twitched and whiskers wiggled as the other women in the chamber perked up their ears, as if waiting for an explanation.
What's love?
Elizabeth repeated.
Well, I never really thought about it. It's always been such a simple, basic thing.
Yet, as Elizabeth looked into each pair of eyes surrounding her, she realized that in Utopia this was not the case. By now, the Alpha's expression was one of intense interest. But there was something more, an edge of fear, of longing, or fear of longing, perhaps.
Let me see,
Elizabeth mused. She silently regarded the other mice for a time as she hastily prepared a lesson, much like in the old days. How might she explain love to her old students? It wasn't something that had ever come up.
Well, love is... It's when you put someone else before yourself.
The Alpha immediately opened his mouth as if to speak.
Ah!
Elizabeth held up a finger, gesturing for him to be silent. Amazingly enough, he obeyed. Elizabeth went on.
What I mean is, someone else matters more to you than you do. You care about them. You want the best for them, the best life, for instance. Or you want them to be the best they can be. When they succeed, you celebrate, as if it had been you. If something bad happens to them, it hurts you. And then you do what you can to make it hurt less.
Elizabeth paused a moment to gauge the Alpha's reaction.
Does any of this ring a bell?
The Alpha scratched his head. I don't have a mother.
Nonsense. Everyone has a mother. Someone had to give birth to you.
The Alpha squinted, that light of thought flickering desperately in his eyes. I don't remember getting a birth from anyone. What's a birth? Elizabeth slapped her forehead.
I can tell this is going to be a tough one.
She paused a moment to gather her thoughts and then began.
Well, no one remembers it. You don't start to remember anything until you start to understand what you see and hear and feel. Then you have something to remember.
Then how do you know what this birth is? One of the women piped up. Elizabeth shot her an irritated glance.
Well, can I get back to you on that?
The woman shrugged and leaned back.
So where was I?
Elizabeth mused.
Right, birth. Well.
She regarded the Alpha a moment longer.
You weren't always an alpha, right?
He shook his head.
You were small once, tiny.
The Alpha nodded.
Right.
Elizabeth went on.
Well, there was a time that you lived inside a woman. When you were large enough, you came out. That's birth. And the woman you came out of was your mother.
For a moment, the Alpha was silent. Then after a time, the dying light roared to life in his eyes as he finally made a connection, and he let out a terrifying howl. A surge of adrenaline shot through Elizabeth, sending her scurrying for the exit and hiding just outside the entrance. Yet as Elizabeth lingered and listened, she realized the howl was not a threat, nor did it express rage. As she peered back into the dim chamber, she could make out the Alpha, holding his head in both hands and weeping bitterly.
Alpha?
Just go away. I was fine until you came along.
You didn't look fine,
Elizabeth muttered. She heaved a sigh and crept back into the nesting chamber.
What's wrong?
You, was the angry answer. You and your talk about this love garbage and mothers and sweaters and... Where do you get these ideas anyway?
Elizabeth shrugged.
Just the facts of life.
Not here. Not in Utopia. No one loves anyone here. We just eat and mate and blazes take anyone that gets in our way.
Elizabeth didn't answer. She could see the agitation in the Alpha's motions as he rocked back and forth in his corner, rubbing his muzzle and forehead. She could hear the torment in his voice as he spoke, so she waited and listened.
And then you waltz in, take everything from me, and tell me I'm missing something I didn't know was there to miss?
The Alpha mumbled.
Lost my standing and my mother in one night.
I'm sorry.
Elizabeth whispered.
About your mother, I mean. I had no idea.
The Alpha sniffed.
Just popped me out and left me for dead.
Well, why shouldn't she?
Another woman blurted out. Elizabeth shot her a confused look.
Wait, what?
She probably never wanted you to begin with, the woman jabbered. You just suddenly start growing in her.
The Alpha let out a despairing wail and covered his ears.
Making her fat and slow, and then you pop out and start bawling. So that's what those things are, a second woman shouted. I had no idea, thanks. A person can't get enough moments sleep.
Elizabeth's mouth hung open in disbelief.
How do you not? Children don't just start growing, you have to...
Elizabeth's voice died in her throat as something small and still caught her eye, laying against the wall near her feet. At first she had mistaken it for a bit of fuzz. It had only been a faint blur out of the corner of her eye. As she knelt closer for a better look, however, she recognized it. It was a tiny mouse which appeared to have been gnawed in half. Elizabeth's stomach twisted into knots, and her eyes burned with hellfire as she looked up again.
What is this?
Oh, that, a third woman mused absently. I gave it to a biter, so he'd leave me alone. I didn't like the way he was looking at me, and I didn't know what else to do with it.
I get the picture,
Elizabeth growled. She didn't bother counting to 10. Elizabeth knew exactly what she was going to do next.
You!
She shouted to the Alpha.
Come with me!
The Alpha fell silent as he lifted his gaze to her. Huh?
Now!
The Alpha paused a moment, and then crawled after Elizabeth as she stormed out of the nesting chamber and down the spiral stairway leading up to it. Where are we going? The Alpha called after her.
Away from here,
Elizabeth answered.
as far as we can go.
She stopped beside the fence, just under the camera's shadow.
I don't want to live in a world without love.
Her voice shook as she shed a tear.
I hate this place.
She reached a finger towards the fence, then jerked it back at the first sensation of a shock. Really? The Alpha called. After a moment's hesitation, he added, Me neither. Wait, what are you doing? Elizabeth leapt at the fence and hung on for as long as she could manage. Electricity crackled, every nerve in her body burning as the volts coursed through her. She fell to the ground, blackened lines streaked across her palms, every hair on her body standing on end. For a time Elizabeth lay there, panting and waiting for the sensation to return to her extremities. Are you crazy? The Alpha exclaimed.
I saw a mouse climb the fence earlier,
Elizabeth answered.
There must be a trick to it. Self-control, maybe? Maybe I can fight the pain, just long enough to get off a few words.
To what? The eye?
All at once the color drained from the Alpha's face.
You're trying to call Demon, aren't you?
Elizabeth groaned, nodding as she sat up.
He knows how to get in and out. If I want to get out, I'll need his help.
With that, she took another running jump at the fence, this time leaping just a bit higher. Yet the moment she got a hold of the metal wire and the pain came rushing back, Elizabeth found it impossible to remove her hand and reach for a higher wire. A moment later, she fell to the ground once more. Elizabeth coughed and squeezed her eyes shut with a despairing moan.
It's no use.
But that didn't stop her from staggering back to her feet to try again.
Wait! Stop!
The Alpha shouted, seizing Elizabeth by the shoulders.
Let me go.
Elizabeth snapped, elbowing him in the stomach. The Alpha's grip slipped, and Elizabeth broke free for a third attempt. This time she managed to let go with one hand, but the pain proved too much for her remaining hand to maintain its hold, and she tumbled back to the ground.
Stop! The Alpha exclaimed. You're going to kill yourself!
Elizabeth screamed in frustration and struck the ground with her fists.
What am I missing? There has to be a way.
I just used rubber gloves,
a faint voice squeaked, his words edged with just the slightest hint of a lisp.
And rubber socks, too.
Elizabeth's vain struggle against the fence had drawn many observers from both sides. Mice gathered from Elizabeth's quadrant in a semicircle behind the former Alpha, and likewise a crowd from the neighboring quadrant gathered as well. Elizabeth hadn't noticed in her fervor to climb the fence. Now, however, as the former Alpha helped her into a sitting position, there was one mouse in particular that grabbed her attention. Little Mr. Nelson had to fight against the mass of larger bodies as he shoved his way to the front. He recognized Elizabeth's voice, as well as the sound of surging electricity. Now he stood at the head of the crowd of mice, peering through the fence to Elizabeth.
Mr. Nelson?
Elizabeth gasped, her head still spinning from the fence's shock. She paused to take a deep, sharp breath.
It is Mr. Nelson, right?
The little mouse didn't answer, but he really didn't need to. Elizabeth's guess, of course, was correct. Instead, he motioned towards the camera. "What do you want with the doc?"
Nothing.
Elizabeth answered.
I wanted to contact.
"Dr. Chuckles," Mr. Nelson cut her off. "Yeah, the specimens call him Demon. He prefers to be called Dr. Chuckles, unless he wants you to be afraid of him. And trust me, lady, he doesn't want you to be afraid of him." Glancing to the former alpha, Mr. Nelson added, "You, on the other hand, can shake in your boots." Turning his attention back to Elizabeth, Mr. Nelson asked, "So, what do you want with the doc?" Elizabeth's eyes blurred with tears as she thought back to the nesting chamber.
I want to leave.
"Why, food not to your liking?" Before Elizabeth could answer, however, Mr. Nelson added, "Forget it. It's none of my business." With that, he clambered up the fence, utterly unfazed by the surging electricity, and sharply rapped against the camera's lens as if knocking on a door. "Hey, Doc! She's ready!"
She's ready?
Elizabeth repeated under her breath. Her heart sank into her stomach as Elizabeth was overwhelmed with the sensation of having just played into the hands of a master chess player. Elsewhere in the facility, two sets of eyes, not present in the enclosure, witnessed Elizabeth's ill-advised attempt on the fence. One stirred from a grim workshop nestled between two air ducts. The other gave an excited shout of, "I found her! She's alive!" In a rush of motion, Peter burst into the library, where Stu and Monster had been looking over some of the volumes on the shelves.
"Well, I take it back," Stu remarked. "She wouldn't like this place. The books are all the same, just page after page of Jupiter yakking about how great he is."
Stu irritably jammed the book back into its place on the shelf, and it slid in just a bit further than it should have. There was a light click and a low rumble as the 5 lowest shelves swung forward, revealing a hidden chamber just behind. Monster stood up and peered into the new opening.
"What's this? More secrets?"
"Was an accident, I swear!"
Stu exclaimed. Monster peered out the corner of his eye at Peter.
"It would appear your father has been holding out on you."
Peter scowled through the opening, his whiskers twitching uneasily. "I'm still not convinced he is my father." With that, Peter hooked his fingers around the side of the shelves and pried them further open. Matrix scuttled down Peter's arm and poked about the new chamber as Peter entered. "More shelves," Peter mused. These ones, however, were dusty and their volumes not as well maintained. "What are you hiding, Jupiter?"
"You know, he might have just been showing us what we were asking for," Stu piped up. "Y'all were in kind of a rush."
"I sincerely hope that's the case," Peter mused as he cracked open a musty tome. "I dearly hope so." Yet as he flipped through the tattered pages, Peter's scowl grew deeper. "Tell me, Stu, does this handwriting look like the penmanship in the volumes you skimmed?" He turned the book around, holding it open for Stu to read. Stu shook his head.
"Nah, the writing out there was all neat and fancy. That looks like..."
"Like the scrawling of a madman," Peter finished. "And he writes of tests and injections and the reactions of the subjects." Peter snapped the book closed and set it on a circular table at the center of the room.
"Does this mean something to you?"
Monster asked. Peter nodded. "I fear it may mean we've walked into a trap." Monster and Stu glanced at each other.
"Well, who would want to trap us?"
"Not you," Peter muttered. "Me. Your part in all this is purely incidental."
"That explanation you keep promising," Monster guessed.
"You must understand, this isn't something I enjoy discussing," Peter added. "But, well, I don't see any way around it now."
"Well, we're waiting,"
Stu interjected.
"Ow!"
Monster gave him a warning swat over the head.
Okay, I get the hint."
Peter grunted wearily, the closest to a chuckle he could manage. After a moment, he spoke up again. His name was Remus. The moment Peter said it, an unnatural chill swept through the room, setting Stu's fur on end and peppering Monster's bare skin with goosebumps. I see you remember the name, Peter observed.
Ain't that what y'all called?
Stu gulped.
I know it was only a dream, but...
Peter nodded. To our mother, we were Romulus and Remus, named after the mythic founders of Rome. To the scientists who experimented on us, however, we were only specimens 548790231 and 548790230. As the elder brother, his identification was earlier numerically than mine. Peter bared his arm, revealing the digits branded into his skin for Stu and Monster to see.
Monster grunted. I don't recall seeing anything on his forearm.
I can only guess at how he managed to hide it, Peter admitted. But if he did, I can imagine a good many reasons why.
He didn't want to be recognized,
Monster guessed. Indeed, Peter nodded ruefully. He hates me. We had, well, something of a falling out the last time I saw him. I always thought he would have died in my absence, until Arnold caught up to us. Monster raised a curious eyebrow. The robot hedgehog, Peter clarified. You saved us from it outside Fairville, if you'll recall. Stu rolled his eyes to the ceiling and rubbed his thighs absently.
Yeah, don't remind me.
That was when I knew Remus was still alive, Peter added. Or, rather, when I suspected. I held out hope he had managed to program and modify the Arnold as a last attempt at vengeance before he died. Now, Peter held up the old book and flipped through several pages. Now I'm not so sure. Remus had a condition, you see. He was injected with an earlier variant of the formula that gave me my intelligence. He grew far more brilliant than I could ever hope to, but there was a side effect. Peter studied the handwriting in the volume for a time, observing how it changed slightly from the front to the back. He then plucked another book from the shelf and examined the handwriting in that one. From what I can discern from these notes, it would appear he found a cure, or at least a treatment.
And we just walked into his lair, Monster growled.
Indeed, Peter agreed.
Well, we need to get out of here,
Stu exclaimed. Peter nodded. Yes, you should. All of you. Yes, Matrix, even you. I don't know what Remus is doing here, and I don't know what he might do to all of you. Monster regarded Peter for a time. He didn't like the tone in Peter's voice.
And what about you? Elizabeth wouldn't want us to leave you behind.
Well, dear little Bess isn't with us now, is she? Peter snapped. He winced in pain as the words came out. He didn't care for his tone any more than his companions did. I'm sorry. It's just that I've seen her on Jupiter's monitors, and I'm not sure where the associated camera is. If I can find that out, it will greatly reduce the time we need to find her.
And if this Remus kills you? Monster asked.
Then the rest of you will still be free to save her without me. Stu shook his head.
Nah, Elizabeth wouldn't like that.
And if we stayed with you, Monster mused, fingering his halberd, perhaps Remus wouldn't have such an easy time subduing you.
You don't know him, Peter insisted. He wouldn't have to fight you head on. He could think his way around your strength. I've seen him play our enemies like puppets on strings. I've seen him concoct fates for his victims worse than death, I suppose. His mind is not something to trifle with. He is disturbed beyond your understanding. Or mine, for that matter. Monster nodded.
All the more reason for us to stay together.
Oh, I was afraid y'all'd say that.
Stu rubbed his forehead and shrugged.
Fine then, I'm staying too.
Matrix added. Then there came a sound of a light click as a door swung open in the next room.
My, how touching, yet completely unnecessary.
A shadow passed across the doorway as Jupiter looked in on his guests.
I see you've found my private library.
Peter turned around to face Jupiter and held up one of his journals.
And I see you found a cure." Jupiter shrugged, flashing an indifferent smirk.
"It makes my work so much easier when I'm not distracted."
"And what now?" Peter asked. "Now that we're here."
"Now?" Jupiter gazed absently into space. "Now? I help you. You still have a friend to rescue, yes?"
"And then?" Monster growled. Jupiter glanced in Monster's direction.
"Then you stay. Or leave. I would prefer if all of you stayed. I've grown lonely over the years. To be frank, this is nearly the happiest day of my life."
Jupiter took in the confused expressions of the others for a moment. "What are you up to?" Peter whispered, his eyes narrowing with suspicion.
"Up to, brother?" Jupiter mused. "Do I really have to spell it out for you, Romulus?"
Why don't y'all just humor us, eh?"
Jupiter kept his gaze firmly locked onto Peter, but he did chuckle at Stu's comment.
"Isn't it obvious? I forgave you years ago."
Peter, however, wasn't convinced. "Then why the charade? The deceptions?" Jupiter shrugged.
"I was afraid, I suppose. We parted under unfortunate circumstances. I said a great many things I regret."
Jupiter cocked his head to the other side.
"I really am sorry, brother. For everything. Anyway," Jupiter eagerly changed the subject. "Have you had any luck?"
Peter was silent for a time. At long last he nodded. "Some. I had questions."
"Ask away, brother."
"About these monitors," Peter began, and stepped cautiously into the neighboring room. "I need to know the location of a camera." Jupiter followed Peter as he returned to the room with the various screens, leaving Monster, Stu, and Matrix alone in the dark.
"I don't like this,"
Monster growled.
"Yeah,"
Stu agreed.
"Me neither."
Matrix squeaked. Nor did Peter like what he found upon returning to the workroom, for every screen on the security console had gone black.
"Ah, yes, it does that once in a while," Jupiter explained. "I was actually in the midst of investigating when I found you."
"Then there is a third rat," Peter gasped.
Jupiter shrugged. "Possibly, possibly not. It could be anything."
Yes, it could have been anything, but as I'm sure you can guess, it was not.